As always, some of the subject matter in this video may be disturbing to some listeners, and viewer discretion is advised. And if you have a scary story you would like to send my way, go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And of course, thank you. So, I live in Maryland. I don't live far from the Pocomoke State Forest. It's supposed to be notoriously haunted. My sister and I have always been into the paranormal. I've seen a few things in my life, but never anything that terrified me as much as what we saw in the forest that night. This happened 3 months ago, and still scares me when I think about it. So, my sister and I were actually riding around, bored, trying to come up with something to do. I came up with the great idea of going to the forest, since it's only 20 minutes away. So, as we're driving there, we get about 5 or 6 minutes from the forest, and I start to hear this strange sound coming from inside my car. It gave me the chills, but my sister didn't hear it at first, so I checked everything in the car, making sure the radio was off completely. Even the heat was off, and I made sure all the vents were closed so there was no air coming through them that could be possibly making this noise. Right at that very moment, it grew louder. Like, it was clear as day. And at this point, I knew my sister was hearing it by the look on her face. It literally sounded like some kind of Native American tribal music, maybe? I still don't know, but that's the best that I can describe it. The first thought I had was that it sounded like someone was playing a flute inside of my car. I have a Honda Accord, so the front seats can only fit 2 people, and yet this music was clearly coming from right in between us, as if someone was sitting in the back seat and they were leaning forward and playing this music right in between both of us. This went on for a good 4 to 5 minutes, and stopped when we arrived at the forest. Although it freaked us out, we were more excited than anything for some reason. So the forest has trails everywhere. You can ride your car or walk. They have campgrounds and parks for children. It's a really beautiful place. So the second that we arrived, I immediately had this sick feeling in the pit of my stomach, and my heart was just pounding. I told my sister that I felt it was safer for us to just ride through in the car. I mean, it was like 12 a.m. at this point, and super dark. So, when we first entered, we drove through where the campgrounds were and everything, and we drove a little deeper in and came to this one park. For some reason, we both decided to just get out and sit on the front of my car to see if anything happened. The first thing that I noticed was how eerily quiet it was out there, and so very dark. I could hardly see much, so I turned on the car headlights. At first, it was really quite amazing. Stuff was happening, but I wasn't afraid. Like I said, at first it was so quiet that I could hear my own heart pounding, and the air was somewhat thick. It almost seemed like it was slightly harder to breathe. I do remember telling my sister, "This is wild. Like, I don't hear anything. Literally nothing. Not even an animal walking through the forest. Just absolutely nothing." About maybe 10 minutes in, I'm starting to hear shouting off in the distance, but not super far away. I know for sure it was the sound of men shouting. Then, I start hearing heavy gunshots everywhere. It sounded like we were in the middle of war as the sounds grew closer and louder. I wasn't afraid though. It was actually pretty cool. So that went on for maybe a few minutes and then stopped. My sister and I stayed for maybe another 25 to 30 minutes, with nothing else happening, and we decided to drive to another part of the forest. As soon as I got into the driver's seat, this feeling of just complete terror came over me. It made me feel so sick to my stomach that I almost vomited. My ears and face were also burning up, like I had the worst fever I could ever imagine. My ears were just so hot. I told my sister several times that my ears were on fire, my stomach was upside down, and that we needed to go because something's not right. We debated for a couple of minutes. She wanted to stay longer because she said she also had a feeling of some kind of presence being there. Not even 2 minutes later, I hear my sister say, "What the hell is that?" as I was looking down at my phone. I look out the passenger window at the tree line where she was staring, and at first I saw nothing. Then, out of nowhere, it was like the darkness lifted just a little, to where I could clearly see something peering out at us from behind a tree. My feeling of dread grew so much worse at that moment, but not wanting to scare my sister even more, I said, "It's just a deer. We should probably go, though." We could see its eyes glowing, just staring right at us. But it was something about the eyes. I just knew it wasn't right, and that it wasn't a deer. So, as we're about to pull off, this thing stood up like a human would, except it was much larger. I wanted to leave that second, but couldn't help but to see what it was doing, and it just out of nowhere jumped off the ground, literally to the top of the trees. I lost it from there. It's worth mentioning that the trees at the Pocomoke State Forest are super tall, so whatever this thing was, it wasn't right. That's the best way I can explain it. It just wasn't natural. Although it did look like an animal, it didn't at the same time. Without hesitation, I peeled the hell out of there, afraid of what this thing might do. The park was already closed, so as I got to the entrance, the gate was closed. I rolled down my window screaming, "Someone open this gate now, or I swear I will run through it." So they opened it, and I dipped so fast and never looked back. I've never been to that forest since, but I have had a few strange things happen since then. That very same night, after I dropped off my sister at her house, I heard that music again in my car for about maybe a minute, and it scared the hell out of me. But oddly, also gave me this calm feeling that came over me, and I wasn't scared anymore. Then it went away, just like that, and I've never heard it since. Thank you for reading, and I apologize that this was so long. I just didn't want to leave out any details. This is actually my first time telling this story. I have no idea what that thing was, and was curious if anyone had similar experiences or knew what that thing might have been. No matter how hard I try to forget, it's like I just can't unsee what I saw that night. This happened to me about 10 years ago when I was 14. It was a warm summer night in 2012, 14, female at the time. I was walking around the city with my friends R, 16 male, and his older cousin J, 24 male. We had all been neighbors for about 4 years now, and our families knew each other, so it was quite normal for us to all be hanging out together despite the age gaps. During our walk, we decided to take a shortcut through the cemetery. It was after hours, and I'm pretty sure it was illegal for us to be in there at the time, but we weren't doing anything other than cutting through, which we would often do during the day as well. As we were walking down the path, we saw headlights turning into the cemetery, and the boys, of course, darted way ahead of me into the tree line. Since the boys ran ahead of me off the path and away from the lights, it was pitch black. There was residual light twinkling through the branches as I made my way down into the trees, but it dropped down to a slight hill and the light was lost. I was walking along, trying to be as quiet as possible, almost blind due to my eyes not adjusting yet, and that's when the feeling of dread set in. I had no idea where the boys were. I couldn't see, and I didn't want to be caught by the police by myself. But there was something else. Almost a chill in the air on this warm night in July. I tried to brush off this uneasy feeling, thinking it was just my nerves or being scared, because the boys took off without me. But alarms were going off in my head. Like something was very, very wrong. And that's apart from the legal reasons that I shouldn't be there. I make out a shape to the left of me as I'm walking. I take a couple steps towards it and say, "Guys, is that you?" Nothing. No response. I take a few more steps forward, and I swear to God, just like the movies, a freaking twig snaps under my foot. Now, the reason I had thought it was the boys is because this shape was crouched down next to a pile of brush and was big enough to look like two people hunching over. I thought that they'd been hiding there, but when the twig snapped, I stopped in my tracks as this thing stood up and towered over me. I was about 5 foot tall at the time, and this thing was easily two of me stacked right on top of each other. Whatever this thing was, it was only 15 feet or so away from me, and I was frozen with horror. It was facing away from me at first, then its neck/head almost swiveled around like an owl, and I was met with an oval-shaped gray face with no nose or mouth. Only two pitch-black hollow eye sockets. The rest of this thing was pitch black against the dark trees. The light from the path was no longer streaming through the branches. It was just me and this thing that seemed like the personification of darkness itself. This thing and I stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. The woods around me, through the corners of my eyes, were getting darker, and my heart was pounding so hard that I could feel it through my entire body. Every tiny hair on my body was prickling. I was cold. The only thing I can remember thinking was, this is it. I'm never going to see my family again. The body of this thing had followed its head and swiveled, so now I could see its long, curved arms held right up to what would be its chest. Its legs were similarly curved, almost like it wasn't standing at full height, but still slightly crouching down. Its body was almost translucent, and it looked like it was wearing some kind of hooded cloak that was see-through as well. The only thing that was 100% solid was its face, and its void-like eyes that made me feel like I was staring right into the depths of hell. Neither of us moved. We were locked in the most terrifying staring contest for what felt like an eternity until a strange feeling came over me. I felt like I could move again, and I had the energy to run a 5K marathon without breaking a sweat. Then, I heard a very calm but stern voice say, "Go. Now. Run." It's kind of hard to explain where the voice was coming from exactly. It was sort of in my head, but all around me at the same time. I'm getting chills as I write this. I know the voice did not come from whatever this thing was in front of me, because when I heard the voice speak, it looked as if this horrid creature recoiled at the sound of it. Like, it took a step or two backwards and kind of ducked its head down. I saw this as my chance, and I turned away from this thing, and I start bolting down further into the tree line, no longer caring about being quiet, and crashing through the bush like an animal being chased by some predator. I could almost feel this thing right on my tail, but after running about 200-ish feet, I run directly into the boys, literally crashing into them. I'm obviously scared and pissed, so I asked why the hell they left me like that, and they apologized. Apparently, I'd been missing for almost half an hour, and they had already searched in the direction that I ran from. They heard weird whispering voices all around the woods while I was gone, like the voices were coming from everywhere around them. They said right before I crashed into them, the whispering stopped. I told them about what I saw, and all they said was that we should get out of there. We left the cemetery very quickly, and as soon as we walked out of the gates, it was like we all let out this sigh of relief. We never talked about that night again, and even during the day, none of us ever took that shortcut through the cemetery. I still live in the same city, and to this day, I avoid it like the plague. I won't even drive by it. This isn't my only story, but it's definitely one of the more terrifying ones that still haunts me to this day. When I was in 7th grade, my family decided to move. My father found a house to rent for cheaper than it should have been, and a 6-month vacancy. I'm not sure why we still moved in after learning about some of what had happened there. Once we moved in, it seemed like my parents were different people. My mother became more withdrawn and began to drown herself in religion, while my father began to become aggressive and threatening worse than he had ever been. Even my baby sister began to exhibit strange behaviors. She began to sleepwalk oftentimes, stopping to stand at the door leading to the basement. I felt like I was going crazy in that house. No one seemed to notice the worsening behavior of my family, or perhaps they didn't care. The room I stayed in this house was at the top of the stairs. I could look out my door and down the hall towards my parents' room. My closet door was small enough that I had to crouch to get through, and near impossible to open due to an excess of paint on it. I ended up putting an armoire against it so that I could stop worrying about it opening on its own. My parents' room resided opposite mine, at the far end of the hallway. When they had been setting up their room, they'd found knives. And not just a couple of them, no. The knives lined the wall around the floorboard. Some were stabbed in, but most were just laying there. The closet was not spared from an overabundance of kitchen utensils, all reflecting the eerie yellowed light. Stranger still were the scratches in the paint. They were messy and looked to have been done by a person. Most of them were on the sloped ceiling of the closet. Arguably, my sister had the most normal room. The only strange thing was the crawl space entrance above her bed. It would creak open on occasion, but was dismissed as a raccoon even after she claimed to have seen a face. The rest of the house was terrible. It was yellowed from cigarette smoke. A patch of carpet was cut out due to a stabbing incident by the tenants before us, and there seemed to be an ever-present chill in the air. No areas were worse than the basement and the garage. As per my bad luck, it seemed we had a spider infestation in the basement. Along with that, for some reason, our shower was located down there. The basement was unfinished. It was always dusty and smelled of mold. The garage had a lofted area that always felt like it hosted something more than a couple of stray cats or some birds. It always seemed to slightly smell of rot. I hated it. I couldn't sleep when in that house, which was nothing short of a blessing half the time, as it seemed the worst happened come evening. One night, my father wandered down the stairs to the living room where my mother and I were sat reading. He looked dazed. Not all there. His eyes seemed distant and unfocused, until he spotted my mother and I, and then he seemed to be overtaken by rage. He had rushed over and tried to attack my mother, and when that didn't work, he grabbed a vase and yelled at the two of us. He asked which one wanted to die first, because he was going to kill us and take my sister with him. I was scared. I panicked, and in a state of blind fear, I punched him. He had luckily dropped the vase, and he seemed to go back to the dazed state, no longer filled with anger. He turned from my mother and I, said something that neither of us could make out, and began to go back upstairs. I decided to follow him up and make sure that my sister was safe, and all he did was walk to his room. His behavior became more extreme over the time that he remained there. I noted a distinct lack of the smell of alcohol that was on him, or rather a smell similar to both what was in the basement and garage seemed to follow him. A mix of dust and sweet rot. My mother kicked him out a few weeks later, seeming to come to her senses after he had swung at me in front of her. It seemed that after he left, the house became angry. My sister seemed to become a target. She was more violent than any 3-year-old should have been. A couple of weeks after we returned to the house, this time lulled into a sense of false security by the absence of my father, on one of the nights that I was unable to sleep, I had heard footsteps on the stairs. I sat silent in my bed, hoping that it was just my sister sleepwalking. I then heard the door slam, followed by my sister screaming. I rushed downstairs, followed closely by my mother. The basement door was patched shut with a sliding lock, but on the other side was my sister screaming and crying in panic. I was accused of locking her down there. My mother never did believe me when I said I had seen a head peeking through the gap of the stairs, just watching. Due to this event, I was not allowed to do anything. My mother upped the chores that I was to do, but it seemed that most of these were in the basement. She demanded that I scrub the shower, wash the laundry, sweep the seemingly never-ending dirt that settled down there, even clear off the old cobwebs and spiders that resided in the rafters. She would scream at me when I would leave the basement before I was finished. I hated being down there. I felt like I was being constantly watched. Sometimes things would move, boxes would tip and spill, things would hit me even when I was the only one down there. One of the more extreme events that I remember happened when I was doing laundry. I was transferring the wash into the dryer when suddenly the room seemed to hold more of a chill than it had before. Something rolled into my ankle, and I jumped. When I turned around to grab my basket, I noticed a dark shape just standing there. I blinked, thinking perhaps it was my eyes playing a trick on me, but it seemed to come closer, motioning forward. As stupid and cliché as it is, the room seemed to grow colder as it moved forward, and a sickly sweet smell of mildew seemed to become overwhelming. I let whatever it was get entirely too close. I was desperate to know what it was. I couldn't make out much. It was human-shaped, tall, and shadow-like. Once I realized how close it was, I sprinted up the stairs only to find the door locked. I panicked and I slammed myself into the door. I could hear something akin to scraping. I lunged to the door that led to the outside of the house, tripping on the small lip of the door. The alarm that we had went off, and as I went to slam the door, I saw that same head sticking out from underneath the stairs again. We moved out not long after this, thank goodness. I haven't really told anyone about this as no one seems to believe me. I've attempted to ask my parents about what happened there. My father claims he doesn't remember much about living there, and what he does remember is foggy at best. And my mother has just claimed that it was normal for strange things to happen in old houses. I don't think what happened was normal. And I know that it was real. Sorry for this being long and just kind of everywhere. I just really needed to tell someone about this, as it's been eating at me ever since it happened. As a kid, I was always sensitive to paranormal stuff, and was never really freaked out. So, it threw me for a loop to be suddenly living in fear. This story did not happen directly to me, but to my mom back in the late 70s, when she was in her early 20s. She and her friend Connie were taking a road trip through a few different states, and were currently driving through Arizona. On this night, it was around 10 or 11 p.m. when they were both starting to feel too tired to keep driving. So, they decided to pull over and spend the night at a hotel or motel at the next exit. After a few miles, they came across an exit off the highway that showed signs for a gas station and a motel. They pulled off the exit and found a small motel that had a near-empty parking lot. At first, my mom and Connie weren't sure if this place was even operating, due to how run down and empty it looked. But there was a tall lit-up sign on the tall motel sign, indicating that they had vacancy. My mom said that she particularly remembers a cold shudder running down her back as they pulled into the parking lot. She looked around and noticed that there was only one other car parked in the entire lot. They got out of the car and walked into the main lobby. They had to ring one of the service bells a couple of times before an older-looking man, probably in his late 60s, entered from the back room. My mom said that he approached them with an eerie look, and they said that they would like one room for the night. The motel clerk didn't say anything, but handed them the registration forms. My mom recalls noticing as Connie was filling out the paperwork, the clerk was eyeing both of them in a very suspicious way. After they paid, he handed them a key and told them they'd be in the room they would be in. They left the lobby and returned to their car to retrieve their luggage and headed towards their room. My mom said their room was located on the farthest end of the motel lot, right by the creepy deserted road that they had turned off of. This made her feel very uneasy, but she tried to shrug it off and hoped they would just be able to turn in and get back on the road after a few hours of sleep. So, they let themselves into the room, clicked on the light, which only barely lit up the room, and got settled in. The room had 2 beds and a dresser in between the two, as well as a bathroom towards the center back end of the room. As my mom set her suitcase onto one of the beds, she noticed on the headboard in the wall right above it, there were hundreds of hand-carved crosses all over it. She took a step back and observed the entire area. It was covered in crucifixes on every inch of the headboard. She was just about to notify Connie of the creepy observation when she suddenly noticed the scratching sounds. Across the room, there was a closed door, and from that area, she heard what sounded like an animal on the other side of it, scratching at the door. My mom took a few cautious steps towards the door, and heard the sounds of a very impatient dog scratching and whimpering. She guessed that there was an adjoining room that this door led to, but still didn't want to open it and find out, in the case this dog could be hostile. Connie was equally weirded out, and decided to call the lobby to notify the desk clerk of this. As Connie was on the phone, my mom took some more time to check out the rest of the room that was giving her more and more creepy and unnerving vibes. She noticed something on the dresser between the 2 beds, and saw that it was a small printed out receipt. She picked it up, and saw that it was a receipt for the exact same date and same room for this very motel. It had a time printed on it, showing for 9 p.m. My mom was immediately weirded out by this. Someone had just checked this room out but was not in this room. As Connie was reporting the strange dog next door, my mom turned to her and held up the receipt card to show her. My mom asked for the phone and told the desk clerk that she had found a receipt for their room for this very same day that was apparently printed out just an hour or two ago. She demanded to know what this was all about. The desk clerk just replied in a monotone voice, "The dog was abandoned by the last person who stayed in your room. He checked in around 9 but checked out shortly after. We have no idea where he went, but his dog was left here. We'll call the local animal control in the morning." And with that, he hung up. My mom just stared blankly at the receiver before hanging up. She turned to Connie and relayed what she was just told. Connie agreed that this place was giving her nothing but creepy and bad vibes, too. I mean, why was the last person who was here just there to leave their dog? And why would the motel give them the exact same room that someone else had checked into not just 2 hours ago? Of all the other apparent vacant rooms, why give them this one? Maybe they were being paranoid over nothing, or maybe something was wrong that was happening at this hotel. All my mom and Connie knew was that they did not want to spend one more minute in that place. So, they quickly gathered up their belongings, ran out to their car, and sped off. Fortunately, they were able to find a larger and more populated hotel about 20 miles later and checked in there. Now, I know this story doesn't really have a scary or terrifying outcome, but to my mom's experience, this was one of the creepiest moments of her life. Sure, there could have been a lot of explanations for the strange dog on the other adjoining room, or the strange carvings in the wall and the headboard, or even for the last guest checking into the same room an hour or two before them. But both my mom and her friend were listening to their intuition, and that was telling them to get the hell out of that place, as neither of them felt safe. I'm a female. When I was 16, I lived in the Valley area of Los Angeles. This was many years ago. As I explained in an earlier story, at this time the best part of my week was Saturday nights, when I would meet my friends at our beloved under 21 nightclub to dance the night away. The vast majority of the time, I'd have to get a ride there and back. I didn't have my own car until a couple of years later when I was in college. But occasionally, a family friend would lend me his car, and on one of these Saturday nights, he did. I felt so independent and free to be able to take myself to the club, and to be able to leave when I wanted. On the night of this story, I drove to the club and had a typical great time, dancing with my groups of friends to music like Prince, Earth, Wind, and Fire. And at the end of the night, I got into my borrowed car and headed toward home. In case you don't know, the San Fernando Valley is made up of many suburban towns. None are really small, and some are very nice. And as you'd expect, some are less nice with higher crime. I lived with my family in a medium town in the northern part of the valley. It was neither very nice nor very bad, with medium homes on mostly respectful if not professionally manicured lawns. And, being the greater Los Angeles area, there were many differing routes I could take to get home, whether freeway, highway, or city street. It was after midnight at this time, but most routes that I could take would still be bustling on Saturday nights. I'd had my fill of loud music, laughter, and chattering voices, so I opted for a quieter route home. I took some busy streets and then veered into some quiet neighborhoods that would take me home. If I drove through some quiet house-lined streets, I would get home a little faster, and I was tired. GPS hadn't been invented at this time, nor even cell phones, so I had to rely on maps, or just knowing the chosen route. I'd heard bad things about a town called Pacoima, but I'd only been through it during the day, maybe once. Still, I knew how to get through to shave a few minutes off my time, and besides, being someone used to walking or taking buses, I felt blissfully perfectly safe now in a well-running car with gas in the tank. I was safer at this moment than almost any other time. At least that's what I believed. Still, I was a teenage girl alone after midnight in an area that I was unfamiliar with, and naive enough to think nothing bad could happen to me in a locked car. I entered a residential street in Pacoima, and only had to go a couple of blocks to get to the next town, then to my own. As I slowly drove down a dark, quiet avenue of modest homes, there were streetlights illuminating the unknown. This also helped with my feeling of invincibility. As I smiled to myself at this, I started to notice a few people walking down the street toward me. At first, I didn't give it much notice. My left turn out of Pacoima was coming up just ahead anyways. But as they got closer, I very quickly realized it wasn't just a few people. It was a gang of approximately 12 to 15 men, and they weren't casually walking down the sidewalk. They were aggressively running down the middle of the street, and right toward me. I suddenly had to slow to almost a stop so as to not hit anyone, and this is when they all got a really good look at me. Looks which turned instantly more excited and animated, as they all realized I was just a young girl alone. Many exchanged smiling glances between them, and others were whooping, whistling, and calling out things to me. Smoothly, effortlessly, as if they had rehearsed ahead of time, several of them stopped me completely by standing right in front of my car, and even putting their hands on the hood, as others walked around to my driver and passenger doors and pulled at the handles to open the doors. I didn't always lock the doors when I drove, and cars didn't really have auto locks back then, but I was thanking God that I'd had the foresight to do it on this night. Of course, it all happened very fast, but in my shock and terror, it felt like slow motion. So, quickly adjusting my mind from carefree to possibly being abducted or worse by this large group of men, they had me trapped. I couldn't drive forward nor reverse out of there because, at this time, the car was completely surrounded by men. And as a couple of guys picked up sticks or other objects to try to bust in my windows, I knew that I had to think clearly and act fast. I did the only thing I could think of. I started driving forward. Having blocked my car completely, I could see the surprise on some of their faces as they knew they had to move out of my way or risk being run over. I had immediately decided that if they didn't move, I would run them over. All the men standing in front of my car quickly jumped out of the way, and I sped up as I took the left turn out of Pacoima. I did make it home safely, but my heart did not stop beating out of my chest for the rest of the night. Of course, I thought about it for a long time after as well. I felt proud of the way that I handled the situation, but kept running through possibilities of what I could have done differently. What if they didn't get out of the way, and I actually hit a couple people with the car? How would I have lived with myself? Should I have just sat in place and honked the horn to hopefully wake up people in their homes around me? What if one of the men had pointed a gun at me? I'm very happy that it turned out the way that it did, but it could have turned out so much worse. So, I hope we'll all keep in mind that we're not quite invincible inside a car, no matter how cozy even heated leather seats may make us feel. Dark, quiet shortcuts are not a good idea, especially late at night. And always drive with your doors locked. So, Pacoima gang that tried to grab and do who knows what to a teenage girl driving alone one late Saturday night? It's been a long time since then, and I'm very glad that I didn't meet any of you ever again. The story may be offensive in places, but it's being told exactly how it has to be. My home state is called Tasmania, an island state of Australia. Some say it isn't a big state, but are often surprised by how big it actually is. There's wilderness, opens, mountains, and a cranking capital city called Hobart. I don't care what people say about it. I love it. I'm from Launceston, the cesspit, I call it. So I moved to Hobart at about 26 to 7 years old for university. And, of course, I needed a job. I was in the prized location, one off Sandy Bay, right near the ocean, all the food shops imaginable, and a supermarket, but most importantly, the university. I found a job pretty quick, waitressing at a steakhouse. And that's where I met, I'll call her Elle for privacy reasons. Elle and I became besties pretty quickly, as we soon learned that we were studying the same subjects at university. After a while, she was needing somewhere to stay as she had broken up with her partner and was finding it hard to get a job and keep it. Her bosses always sleazed on her, and she didn't get why. I said, aside from the fact that you're very pretty, quite a few men here have a preconceived idea of what an Asian girl will do for money. She's petite, gorgeous, intelligent young woman, and I opened the paper to the escorts for hire section and showed her pages of Asian escort ads. This is why you have trouble, I said. At the time, flip phones were still a thing, but cameras had only really just begun. Why does this matter, you ask? Well, I took my friend in to live, and we went shopping one summer day. She wheeled the trolley, and I grabbed the stuff. I'm the tall one, so she was leaning slightly on the trolley as she waited. She had on a cute summery dress with some wedge sandals for height. She was still short. And she looked about 13, maybe 15. We were in the makeup aisle at the time that had happened. Someone caught my eye just past my friend. It was a man with a basket and a phone. A flip phone. A new one. I got a glance at his basket as he grabbed two makeup cases, a blue and a pink one, without really paying attention to what he got. I don't remember anything else that was in the basket now, but back then, you could assume gender without any guilt as such, and so you did. In other words, he didn't look like a man who would normally be in a makeup aisle, and he moved like the wind when he saw me looking at him. I didn't say a word because all I had was instinct, but I knew. I got my friend to come to an open area of the supermarket to test him. We faced the wall, and I made her decide on what to get, which I don't know what it was now, but it was just a distraction. Sure enough, he pulled out his phone, bobbed down, and went to take a photo. I yelled at the top of my lungs, scaring my friend as much as everyone else. He made a run for it as I chased him through to the counter where he almost threw the basket at me to get out. He bolted and no one did anything. So, just putting a warning out there now that phones are more prevalent, you don't really know how a perv may strike. Hello all. I have a story and a problem to tell that I'm hoping you guys might be able to help me with. I'm sorry if this is a little on the long side. About 12 to 13 years ago, I was around 15, and my family and I had moved in with my grandparents for a few months in a new city while we looked for our own house. Turns out, my parents picked a place about 8 houses down from my grandparents. Once they told us, me and my younger brother by 5 years wanted to check it out. So we walked down the street to take a look. In front of the house, there's a giant window that looks directly into the family room, to the dining room, and then out of another giant window in the backyard. So, from the front yard, you could see all the way through to the backyard. When my brother and I had gotten down the street to the new house, we went through the gate in the front yard. When we got to the front window, we both stopped. We looked through into the backyard and we saw something. I have trouble describing it because it didn't really have a shape. It was human-like, but completely dark, and seemed to be made of something not quite solid. Almost like a black smoke. I can't tell you why, but it felt like a man. We both instantly got this overwhelming bad feeling. My brother and I looked at each other, realized we both saw it, and knew that we had to leave, then booked it back to my grandparents. When we got back, I asked if he saw it, which he confirmed he did. After that, we didn't talk about it much. We ended up moving into the house a few weeks later, and nothing much happened while we lived there for about 2 years. I remember a long hallway with a ceiling height mirror that was pretty creepy, but that's about it. After a while, I summed it all up to us being young boys with wild imaginations. A few years later, though, I saw it again. Again, through a window, the same smoky black shape. This was at my college. Nothing happened again, just a feeling of dread, and I walked the other way. Up until now, I've seen him in total around 6 times. So it's not often, but often enough to know it's not me just making things up. It is always through a window, and I always get that awful feeling of needing to leave. The most recent time was a couple of weeks ago, which is why I finally decided to post this here. My hope is that someone has some idea what this could be, as well as how I can get rid of it. Or am I just stuck with this visitor every couple years? I thought that I would share another one of my encounters. This happened in a timeshare apartment in the Lake District. We got the apartment really cheap off of a friend who owns timeshares. The apartment was on the ground floor of a really old hotel. It had a huge lounge with a bedroom off one side. On the wall you faced, there were 3 steps up to the kitchen. The kitchen was weird, as it had a big picture window that looked onto a passageway that led to the front door, into the hotel. Also, the passage had a dog-leg staircase down to a bathroom with a jacuzzi bath. The passageway also had a blocked-up doorway. It was lit by passive lights that came on when you walked out. On the first night, we were tired, so we went to bed about 10. I woke up at 11:15 p.m. and could smell a really sweet perfume. Strong, like someone was waving it under my nose. I reminded myself the next day to look for the offending plug-in, as I thought one was somewhere in the room, and I fell asleep. On our first full day, we went out walking, so we didn't spend much time in the apartment. When we got back, I made us a sandwich, and while I was busy, the passive light in the passage kept coming on by itself. Very strange. We had our sandwich, and then I decided a glass of wine in the jacuzzi would be lovely. After I had finished and tried to leave, the door to the bathroom became stuck. I tugged like mad to no avail. I shouted for my husband. Nothing. I kept trying the door, and after a good 10 minutes, it just opened. No problems. I turned the light off in the bathroom, started up the stairs into the pitch black, and waited for the passive to light my way, but it didn't. I waved my arms about like a demented bat, but nothing. So I felt my way up the stairs. As I got around the corner, I expected the second passive to pick me up. It didn't. I flew into the lounge and light, just glad to be back. We just laughed it off. During the night, I awoke at 2:15 and there was the strong smell of perfume in the bedroom again. The next morning, we set about looking for the source of the perfume smell. We looked all over the bedroom, even under the bed, and once again we found nothing. We went out for a few hours. On our return, we put a film on and settled down into the lounge. We had a meal and a couple of drinks. The light in the passageway kept flashing on and off again. We asked reception if a bulb or something needed fixing, and they had a look and said that it was working fine. We put some music on, and after a couple of hours, decided to go to bed. The switch to turn the light off was at the furthest point from the bedroom door, and my husband had gone to bed already. I turned the light off and started to cross the room in the dark, and all of a sudden, 3 bright blue lights crossed the lounge in front of me. Each one had a long tail, and they didn't move fast. They went into the kitchen and disappeared out of sight. I ran the rest of the way into the bedroom, and I told my husband about what had happened. He said he had a weird feeling about the place, and he said he didn't like being in the lounge alone. I noticed that he always went to bed first and left me to turn the light off. I felt unnerved and checked the door twice just to make sure it was shut properly. Later that night, something woke me up. It was that perfume smell. Sickly sweet. I could hear footsteps in the lounge. I started to poke my husband in the ribs, but he wouldn't wake up. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest. All of a sudden, the bedroom door clicked open. I was petrified and put my head under the sheet. I must have stayed like that for over an hour until eventually I must have fallen asleep. I know that if I'd had the guts to look out from under the sheet, there would have been something there. I'm such a coward. The next day, we packed up and we went home. So it's 2:14 at the time that I'm beginning to write this, and the encounter started around 12 a.m. I was lying in bed with one of my 2 cats, watching TV. Red Dwarf, specifically. Something I've seen a million times and is pretty much a comfort show, so I know what I heard wasn't the TV. Suddenly, I heard a faint and rather androgynous voice coming from outside. It was a little high-pitched and whiny. It's hard to recall because I only heard it once, and all it said was, "Hello," with an upward inflection. I didn't really know how to react. I thought it had to have been my other cat, but now I'm thoroughly convinced that it wasn't. Because a few minutes later, there were 3 knocks at my front door in rapid succession. I threw on some clothes really quick and went to see if there was someone at the door. About a sixth of it is window, and I couldn't see anyone or anything from inside through the window. So I just assumed it had to have been the damn cat screwing around. So I went to bed, but was really freaked out. 10 minutes later, and there's a knocking on my door again. Freaked out to hell, I jump up and grab the machete that's near my bed, and I carefully look out the window again before going outside to have a look around. There's no one around again. I go back in and I grab my pellet gun, and I go back to my bedroom because it just feels safer in there. 10 minutes later, again, it's the same freaking knocking at my door. It takes me a few seconds to get there because, at this point, I'm terrified and texting my wife about it. I get outside, and there was nothing. No one. Again. My wife tells me to call the cops, and I do. While waiting for them, I was pacing around the house and ended up walking into the bathroom. While in there, I heard a deep and muffled voice from outside the window very quietly. I basically screamed like a bitch and went back to the bedroom until the cops showed up. They looked around and found nothing, of course. I live in far northern California, if that helps. Does anyone have any ideas what could be going on? Hello. How are you doing this evening? Hopefully you're doing... Hopefully? Oh, jeez. I ruined my stupid outro already by making a mistake. And then I said that really robotic, like it was planned. It was not planned. Anyways, hopefully you're all having a beautiful night, and hopefully you enjoyed this collection of true scary stories, Reddit scary stories as it's titled. However, there were some submitted stories in this one. I know, I'm a liar, I'm sorry. Unfortunately, you get more views and traction if you call it scary Reddit stories. If anyone's ever curious as to why I named them like that, that's why. It works better than just true scary stories to have a something associated with it, I guess. Anyways, hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel, please consider hitting that subscribe button. You can also support the channel by going to Patreon or my join button down below, where for $8 a month, you can get early access to content like this and support the channel further. There's also a thanks button. I don't know what it does other than let you donate to the channel. I don't know how it works. I've never done it. So if you want to do that, go ahead. If you don't want to, I understand. Anyways, yeah. The other thing you could do is leave me a comment down below. That I would appreciate and really would like you to do. Please. Thank you. Anyways. I don't know much to talk about. It's Wednesday. So Wednesdays are as Wednesdays do. They do things and are the way they Wednesday. The day is the Wednes. It just be Wednesday. Today just be Wednesday. Yeah. Anyways, I hope you have a beautiful day, and I hope I see you on the next video. But until then, my friends, sleep well.